Welcome to Volume 2 of True Horror, the real stories behind the movies that haunt us. You've followed us through haunted basements and tormented families, but now we step into cases that didn't just inspire fear, they redefined it. These are the stories that shaped how we understand possession, evil, and the blurred line between psychiatric crisis and supernatural invasion. And it all starts here, with a quiet boy, a grieving family, and a series of exorcisms that became a global phenomenon. But the question that still haunts the case of Roland Doe isn't just, was he possessed? It's, who else knew, and why did they keep it quiet? From there, we plunge into haunted hotels, abandoned asylums, and a house so infamous it spawned decades of debate. Turn the lights down. Volume 2 begins now. If you've seen Psycho, you remember the shower scene. You remember the knife, the scream, the blood circling the drain. If you've seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you remember the masked figure, Leatherface. Chainsaw roaring, dragging bodies down into the pit of the house. If you've seen The Silence of the Lambs, you know Buffalo Bill. The skin, the pit, the ritual. But what you may not know is this. All of those killers, all of those characters, all of those films lead back to a single man. A quiet recluse, living in the woods of Wisconsin. His name was Ed Gein, and his story isn't just horror, it's something much colder. Plainfield, Wisconsin, 1957. The town was small, farming country, one general store, a church, a bar, the kind of place where no one locked their doors, where people nodded to each other at stop signs, where nothing ever really happened. Until the morning Bernice Warden disappeared. She ran the local hardware store. She'd opened the shop like she always did. Then, gone. The register was empty. Blood trailed toward the back door. A missing receipt showed a sale. Antifreeze sold to one customer. Ed Gein. Sheriff's deputies drove to his farm just outside town. What they found inside the Gein house would fracture the psyche of everyone involved. They entered through a shed attached to the house. It was dark, cold. The door creaked open. Inside, a single bare bulb swayed from the ceiling, and hanging from a meat hook was Bernice Warden. Her body had been gutted like a deer, split open, headless. She'd been strung up with expert precision, like someone preparing game for curing. The deputies backed out in horror. They called for backup, and then they made the mistake of searching the rest of the house. They thought they were investigating a murder. They weren't prepared for what they found next. In the kitchen, a bowl made from a human skull. In the bedroom, masks, not plastic, not rubber, but faces, peeled and dried, worn like Halloween disguises. A belt stitched from nippled flesh, chairs upholstered in human skin, a lampshade made from a flayed face, the eyes still intact, and in a shoebox, the preserved vulvas of 9 different women, some labeled, some still fresh, and tucked neatly beneath the bed. A full woman's suit, stitched together from various bodies, breasts, torso, thighs. The skin had been tanned, treated, and sewn, so it could be worn. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He was a collector, a craftsman of death. But here's what many people get wrong. He hadn't killed all those women. Most of the bodies he used came from graves. For years, Gein had been robbing local cemeteries, digging up freshly buried corpses, opening caskets, choosing only the parts he wanted. He told investigators that he'd visit the graves late at night in a kind of trance, that he'd go alone with a lantern and shovel, that some nights he'd dig for hours and then come to his senses and walk away. But other nights, he took them home. Why? That's the question experts tried to answer, and what they uncovered was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Gein had grown up in isolation. His father was an abusive drunk. His brother died mysteriously, possibly at Ed's hands. But it was his mother, Augusta, who shaped him most. She was a fanatical religious zealot. She preached about the evils of women, called them sinners, whores, corrupters. She kept Ed close, told him the world was dangerous, told him he must stay pure. When she died in 1945, something in Ed fractured. He preserved her room as a shrine, untouched, dustless. And over time, he began to believe that if he could just become her, if he could wear the skin of women, he could bring her back. That's why he made the suit, not just to wear, to transform, to walk the house in her flesh, to speak in her voice, to embody the only person he ever truly loved. When investigators asked Ed about the faces, the furniture, the trophies, he was polite, soft-spoken. He didn't seem angry or remorseful. He just said, "I liked how it felt." The public's reaction was swift. The Gine farmhouse was set on fire by locals before it could be turned into a museum. A literal attempt to erase the memory, but the memory didn't die. It metastasized. Robert Bloch, a young horror writer living just 35 miles from Plainfield, read about the case. He wrote a novel, Psycho, about a man named Norman Bates, a motel, a dead mother, a double life. Alfred Hitchcock adapted it for film, and it changed horror forever. But that was just the beginning. Gaines' grotesque imagination inspired Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a character who wears the skin of his victims, and Buffalo Bill, the chilling antagonist in The Silence of the Lambs, a man who kills to craft a woman's suit. The mask, the pit, the transformation, all roads lead back to Plainfield. But what makes Ed Gein more disturbing than fictional killers isn't the gore. It's the fact that he didn't seem like a monster. Neighbors said he was odd but helpful. He babysat their children, shoveled snow, attended church. He lived in plain sight, among them, smiling, quiet, obedient. And every night he went home to a house full of bones. Gein was found unfit to stand trial. He was committed to a psychiatric facility where he remained until his death in 1984. He never escaped, never walked free again. But his legacy, it never went away. Because Psycho, Chainsaw, Lambs, they keep him alive. Reimagined, retold, masked, weaponized. And every time we tell ourselves, it's just a movie, we forget that somewhere. There was a man who did it first. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the cold truth of how real horror hides behind the faces we trust, then don't look away now. Because the next chapter takes us even deeper into the unspeakable crimes that inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And what investigators found in that farmhouse wasn't fiction either. Subscribe, return, because the mask might change, but the face beneath it never forgets. There's something about the sound of a chainsaw that freezes the spine, that unpredictable reverend, that metal scream, that image of a faceless brute chasing strangers down a rural back road under the baking sun. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre first screened in 1974, people didn't just scream, they fled the theater. They whispered this was based on real events. They believed it because it felt too close, too raw, too American. But what if we told you the real story behind Chainsaw isn't just about one killer? What if it's not about Ed Gein alone? What if it's about a pattern, about rural places ignored by the rest of the country, where horror isn't just a story, it's daily life? Let's go back. Not to 1974, but before Leatherface, before the screaming hitchhiker, before the bloody dinner table. Let's go to the dry, open counties of rural Texas, to the forgotten back roads and dying towns where history doesn't get written, it gets buried. Ed Gein's legacy, and what Tobe Hooper saw. Director Tobe Hooper has always maintained that Ed Gein's crimes inspired Leatherface. And yes, Gein carved human masks. He had furniture made of skin. He wore other people's bodies like a costume. But Hooper saw something else too, something different. He was in a department store around Christmas time. The lines were long. People were pushing, arguing. The holiday cheer was thin, and he saw a display of chainsaws in the hardware aisle. He imagined, what if I just started one up and walked out of here? That moment, combined with the news stories of serial killers and the cultural rot beneath polite society, ignited a concept. Hooper didn't want to copy Geen. He wanted to expose what the American countryside was pretending didn't exist. The cannibals of the real-world Texas folklore is filled with stories most people never hear, because they don't make the news, because the victims weren't wealthy, because the police reports go missing, and in some of these stories, there's something worse than murder. There's eating. In the early 20th century, near the Texas-Mexico border, there were whispers of a man named Joe Ball. He owned a tavern in Elmendorf, Texas. It was popular. People came for drinks, for music, for the alligator pit out back. Yes, alligators. Joe fed them scraps, raw meat. Some claimed bodies. Women began disappearing. Barmaids, local girls, girlfriends, one after another. When police closed in, Joe calmly walked behind his bar, pulled a pistol, and shot himself in the head. They never found all the bodies, but the locals still say they're in the pit. Then there was Nathaniel Bar Jonah, a monster who operated far from Texas, yes, but his crimes echo across rural America. He abducted children, tortured them, and according to evidence, cooked and served human flesh to unsuspecting guests. Bar Jonah ground meat into patties, labeled it as deer or elk. But DNA testing suggested otherwise. No one knew what they were eating, and some still don't. Even in Texas prisons, guards reported cases of inmates mutilating others, not out of rage, but out of curiosity. One officer told a journalist, "You think this is hell? It's worse. They eat the weak in here." Back to the film and the lie of safety. The genius of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't its gore. In fact, there's barely any on screen. It's what the camera refuses to show. It's the moment a hitchhiker cuts himself with a razor in a dead quiet van. It's the house in the middle of nowhere that somehow smells wrong. It's the girl running into the woods and realizing there's no help coming. And that's the part most people miss. The scariest thing about the movie is that there's no motive. Leatherface doesn't kill out of vengeance. He doesn't speak. He doesn't gloat. He's a tool of a dying family, of poverty, of decay. They're not haunted. They're not cursed. They're just hungry. Ignored and unseen, the forgotten corners of America. In towns across the American South and Midwest, there are houses collapsing in on themselves, cellars filled with rot, fields where no one goes anymore. And sometimes, just sometimes, people disappear there. They go missing on back roads. They vanish during road trips. Their names are listed in files marked inconclusive. You'll hear phrases like, "She must have run off. He probably joined a cult. Maybe she just didn't want to be found." But locals tell different stories. They talk about houses where strangers are never seen again, about freezers in abandoned trailers, about the smell that came from that shed before it was torn down. Small town secrets. Here's the part no one likes to admit. In places with no press, no oversight, no resources, people get away with anything. A sheriff might cover for a friend. A coroner might lose a report. A missing girl might get blamed for her own vanishing. And the people who know the truth, they don't talk. Because the town protects its own. Because fear is stronger than justice. Because sometimes the devil doesn't wear horns. He wears overalls. Leatherface is real. Just not how you think. He may not have existed as one man, but as an idea, as a presence, he absolutely did. He represents every neglected shadow in this country. every cellar that smells of copper and dust, every truck that slows down just a little too long when it passes you on an empty road. He's the thing we pretend only lives on film. But if you've driven through the wrong part of Texas, if you've seen a house with boarded windows and the sound of something buzzing behind the barn, you start to wonder. Tobe Hooper said it himself. He wanted to make a movie that felt like the nightly news. That told the truth no one wanted to hear. And the truth is this: real horror isn't always personal. Sometimes it's industrial, ritualized, generational, passed down like a family recipe. And in some places, it's still happening. If this chapter unsettled you, if it made you wonder about the land you pass by and the people who live there, then keep going. Because next, we face the man who wore two lives. One in daylight, charming and kind, and one in the dark, filled with bodies buried beneath his home. Chapter 8, The Silence of the Lambs, the Mind of the Real Hannibal. Subscribe, return, and never forget. What Hollywood edits for comfort, real life often leaves in. You can still hear the echoes. In Texarkana, when dusk settles over the treetops and the sky begins to melt into dark violet, an old name is whispered beneath breath: the Phantom. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but something far worse: a man. One who emerged from the shadows in 1946, covered his face with a white mask, and brought fear to a town that thought it had survived its darkest days. Because World War II had just ended. Men were coming home. Families were reuniting. The streets were alive again. But the thing about hope is how fragile it is. All it takes is one unknown face in the night to destroy it. The First Strike, February 22nd, 1946. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry had parked on a secluded dirt road just outside of town, a place locals referred to simply as a lover's lane. The war had ended only months before. People were learning how to relax again, how to breathe, but not that night. At about 11:55 p.m., a man approached their car. He didn't say a word. He wore a white sack over his head with holes cut out for the eyes, and he held a pistol. He ordered them out of the vehicle. Then, without hesitation, he beat Jimmy so savagely that his skull cracked in multiple places. Mary John was told to run, but as she fled, he caught her and brutalized her. She survived. Barely. When police questioned her, she could barely speak. Her description was chilling. He didn't sound drunk. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like he was reading a script. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive, and worst of all, no leads. The second attack, March 24th, 1946. Exactly 4 weeks later, tragedy struck again. This time, Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17, found murdered in their car on a different secluded road. Richard had been shot twice in the back of the head. Polly had been shot once, but there were signs of more. The killer had posed the bodies. Richard was seated upright. Polly lay beside him, face down. Blood soaked the soil under the car. There were signs she may have been moved, deliberately. Police now faced a pattern: young couples, secluded areas, late hours, and a phantom who left behind nothing but terror. Texarkana, once sleepy and proud, began to feel watched. The town shifts and fear grows. By early April, Texarkana changed. Shops began closing early, curfews were whispered, then enforced. People boarded up their windows, armed themselves, slept in shifts. You see, horror doesn't need a face to control a town. It only needs a pattern. And the phantom was methodical. Newspapers from the time wrote it plainly: "The town is afraid to breathe after dark." Gun stores sold out of ammunition. Hardware stores ran out of locks. Men patrolled neighborhoods with hunting rifles, some barely out of their teens. Mothers taught their children to stay away from windows. No one walked alone. Because it wasn't just the murders, it was that each one felt calculated. The killer never stayed long. He never took money or jewelry. He left no DNA, no bullets, no footprints, just fear, pure and cold. The most terrifying night, April 13th, 1946. That evening, the pattern broke. Instead of targeting a couple parked in a car, the phantom struck a home. Betty Jo Booker, 15, was a talented saxophone player. She had just finished a gig with her band at the local VFW club. Her friend, Paul Martin, picked her up around 1:30 a.m. They never made it home. Paul's body was discovered by the side of North Park Road. He'd been shot 4 times. Once through the nose, once in the back of the neck. 2 days later, Betty Jo's body was found nearly 2 miles away, hidden under brush. She had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head. Her saxophone was missing. The town changed again. Nowhere was safe. Not your car, not your home, not your neighborhood. Now, the phantom was hunting. The final confirmed killings, May 3rd, 1946. Virgil Starks was a farmer and welder. He lived with his wife, Katie, on a quiet rural property northeast of town. It was a normal night. He sat in his armchair, listening to the radio. Katie was in another room, preparing for bed. Then, she heard it. 2 gunshots. She rushed in and saw Virgil slumped over, blood streaming from his head. Panicked, she tried to phone for help. But before she could, the killer fired again, this time through the window. Katie was hit twice, once in the face, once in the mouth. But she did something no one expected. She survived. Bleeding and half blind, she ran to a neighbor's house. She lived to tell the story. But the phantom was already gone. Who was he? And why was he never caught? Texarkana law enforcement worked furiously. They interrogated over 400 suspects. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a military man, trained in stealth. Others suspected a locale, someone who blended in. A few whispered that it wasn't a man at all, but something inhuman. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about ghosts, or masked men with knives, or creatures that lurk deep in the woods. Sometimes they live next door, and they smile, and they call themselves your caregiver. This is not a ghost story. This is not a horror inspired by true events. This is a horror that happened in full. And what's worse, no one stopped it. The girl who wasn't supposed to die. Sylvia Marie Likens was 16 years old, born in 1949 in Lebanon, Indiana. She was a teenager like any other, quiet, kind, shy around boys, and fiercely protective of her younger sister, Jenny, who walked with a limp due to polio. Their parents, carnival workers by trade, struggled to make ends meet. The kind of family that floated from town to town, never staying long, always chasing the next paycheck. That instability led to a decision that would prove fatal. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny were left in the care of a woman their parents trusted, a single mother named Gertrude Banaszewski. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, room and board in exchange for $20 a week. It seemed simple, innocent. But within days, Sylvia's life began to unravel. By the time the arrangement ended, Sylvia was dead. The house on East New York Street. Gertrude lived in a rundown 2-story house in Indianapolis with her 7 children. She was thin, frail, sickly even, suffering from chronic asthma and depression. She chain-smoked and floated in and out of lucidity. To outsiders, she looked tired. To those inside the house, she was something else entirely. What began as neglect quickly became punishment. And what became punishment turned into ritual abuse, all because of one rumor, a lie told by one of Gertrude's daughters claiming Sylvia had spread gossip about the family. That was all it took. Their descent into torture. At first, it was slaps, shouting, forced apologies. But Gertrude escalated things quickly. She beat Sylvia with belts and paddles. She starved her, forced her to eat leftovers from the trash. Then, she began to enlist her own children. One by one, they joined in. Then, neighborhood kids, children, teenagers. The house on East New York Street became a playground for cruelty, and Sylvia, the unwilling centerpiece. She was burned with cigarettes, thrown downstairs, forced to strip and perform degrading shows for Gertrude's amusement. The most chilling? When Sylvia was made to insert a Coca-Cola bottle into herself, in front of laughing neighborhood boys. No adults stopped it. No one knocked on the door, even as Sylvia screamed, even as her body bruised and broke. The writing on the flesh. At one point, Sylvia attempted to escape. She banged on the neighbors' doors. She collapsed on porches, but no one helped. Gertrude told the police that Sylvia was out of control, a liar, a slut. She framed her as a burden no one wanted. Then came the final act of degradation. Gertrude heated a sewing needle and, with the help of a boy named Richard Hobbs, carved words into Sylvia's stomach. The phrase, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." Each letter was seared into her skin with terrifying deliberation. This wasn't just abuse. This was systematic dehumanization. And Sylvia, 16 years old, malnourished, shattered in body and soul, still apologized, still asked what she'd done wrong, still begged for forgiveness. The final hours. By October 1965, Sylvia was no longer recognizable. Her face was swollen. Her limbs were covered in sores. She could barely speak. And then, after enduring more than 3 months of calculated torture, she died on the floor of Gertrude's basement. The official cause of death was brain hemorrhage and malnutrition, but we know the truth. She was murdered. By a community of children. By a mother. By silence. The arrest. Too little, too late. When the police finally arrived, they found Sylvia's body crumpled, almost fetal. Jenny, her younger sister, whispered something to the officer as they led her away. "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." And she did. The trial shocked the nation. Gertrude Banaszewski was charged with first-degree murder. So were her children and several neighborhood kids. But the real horror? Most of them got off light. Some served only a few years. Gertrude herself, despite being dubbed the most evil woman alive, was paroled in 1985 after serving only 20 years. She changed her name, moved to Iowa, and lived out her days in obscurity. Sylvia never got that chance. The movie that softened it. In 2007, a film titled The Girl Next Door was released. Loosely based on Sylvia's ordeal, it depicted the abuse, but from a safer distance. It used fictional names, stylized lighting, and a more palatable narrative. It was terrifying, yes, but it didn't come close to the real story, because the truth isn't cinematic. It's raw, unfiltered, cruel without reason. And in Sylvia's case, it shows us something few horror films dare to say. That true evil doesn't need a motive. It doesn't come wrapped in fangs or cloaks or maniacal laughter. Sometimes it wears curlers and smokes Pall Malls. Sometimes it smiles from a porch. Sometimes it tells your parents, "I'll take good care of them." And sometimes no one checks to see if that was true. Sylvia's gravestone carries a message carved in stone by her sister, "Our darling daughter." She is gone, but not forgotten. The house on East New York Street was torn down, but the memory lingers, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a warning. That horror can come from the most familiar places, and when we look away, it grows teeth. Subscribe. Come back for the next chapter, and remember, we don't tell these stories to revel in them. We tell them so they don't happen again, because if this could happen to Sylvia, it could happen to anyone. There's a house on Long Island. It looks like any other from the outside. Colonial, modest, framed by bare trees in winter. But the windows, those half-moon attic eyes, they seem to watch you. That house has a name whispered around the world. And every time it's spoken, it comes with questions. Was it haunted? Was it cursed? Or was it all a lie? This is the true story behind the Amityville horror. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, you may not sleep so easily after hearing what really happened inside that house. 112 Ocean Avenue, the blood before the fear. Before the haunting, there was something worse. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr., age 23, walked into a bar in Amityville, New York. Now Clonaudi Thindi declared, "I think my mother and father are shot." Police rushed to 112 Ocean Avenue and found a scene no one was prepared for. Inside were 6 bodies. His father, his mother, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, all shot execution style in their beds. No signs of struggle. No one had moved. Each victim lay face down, silent, still. Ronald claimed a mob hit it first. Then his story changed, again and again, until finally, under pressure, he confessed. "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He admitted to methodically moving from room to room with a rifle, and no one, not one person, woke up. How? That question has never been answered. Was it drugs, fear, or something else? The Lutz family move. In 1 year later, in December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz moved into the house with their 3 children. The DeFeo murders were disclosed to them. But the price was right. A home that size, that location, they took a chance. They wouldn't last long. 28 days. That's all they endured. And what they claimed happened during that time would spark one of the most enduring hauntings ever recorded in American history. The haunting, night by night. It started small, cold spots, strange odors, footsteps in empty rooms. Then George began waking every night at 3:15 a.m. The exact time the DeFeo murders were believed to have occurred. He grew irritable, unshaven, withdrawn. Friends said he was not himself. Kathy reported levitating in her sleep. The children claimed to see a pig-like creature with glowing red eyes staring into their windows. One daughter, Missy, spoke of an imaginary friend named Jody. Only, Jody wasn't so imaginary. Visitors refused to return. A Catholic priest, Father Ray Pecoraro, came to bless the house. The moment he entered the sewing room, a voice, deep and guttural, told him, "Get out." He left, and later claimed he developed unexplained blisters on his hands. The walls oozed green slime. The Lutzes heard a marching band playing in the middle of the night. Doors ripped off their hinges. A crucifix on the wall turned upside down on its own. Kathy claimed to have seen an invisible force lift George off the bed. One night, she said she woke up, looked in the mirror, and didn't recognize the face staring back. The exit, a midnight escape. After just 28 days, the Lutz family fled the house, left food in the fridge, clothes in the closets. They never returned. They refused to speak about what happened in full for years. When pressed, George would say only, "Something followed us." It wasn't the house. It was what was in the house. The book, the movie, the storm. In 1977, Jay Anson's book, The Amityville Horror, was published. It was an instant success, a terrifying account told from the Lutz family's perspective. Then came the film in 1979. and the legend grew. But soon, so did the doubt. Investigators began pulling apart the Lutz's story. Inconsistencies, missing records. Critics called it a hoax, a publicity stunt, an attempt to cash in on the horror boom. But here's where it gets strange. George and Kathy never wavered. Even on their deathbeds, they insisted, what we said happened, happened. The evidence, or lack thereof. Skeptics point to the absence of hard evidence. No photos, no video, no audio tapes. But believers argue the opposite. They point to a single chilling photograph taken during an investigation by famed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren. The photo shows an empty hallway, except for one thing. Peeking out from a doorway is a small boy, pale, with glowing eyes. The Warrens insisted there were no children present that night. Others claim it's a trick of the light. But one thing is certain. That photo remains unexplained. Voices from inside the walls. In later years, the house passed through many hands. Families moved in and out. Some reported nothing, others strange dreams, sleepwalking, and on rare occasions, whispers inside the walls. The address was eventually changed to stop thrill seekers, but it didn't help. To this day, people still park outside. They take pictures, they lower their windows, and they listen. Some swear they've heard a voice. Sometimes it's calling a name. Sometimes it's laughing. Sometimes it just says two words, get out. Was it real or the perfect American myth? Here's the truth no one wants to say. If the Amityville horror was a hoax, it was an impossibly perfect one. Too many threads, too many witnesses, too much detail. If it wasn't, then what walked the halls of 112 Ocean Avenue wasn't just a ghost. It was something older, something that marked the land before the house was built, and something that may have never left. They say evil leaves an echo, that when something truly vile happens in a place, it lingers, like soot in the walls, like voices in the vents. The DeFeos are still buried nearby. The house has been remodeled, but the name Amityville will never fade. Not because of what was proven, but because of what was felt. And maybe that's the scariest part of all. Subscribe for the next chapter. We're just getting started. And in this next story, the forest hides something far older than man. Stay with us, because the stories that haunt us often have no ending. The Amityville case might be the most famous, most commercialized haunting ever told. But behind the book deals and blockbusters lies a disturbing truth. Something happened in that house. And what happened afterward might have been worse. But our final volume goes somewhere even deeper, past the headlines and into the forgotten. We're venturing into places most won't talk about. A farmhouse with a reputation darker than any script. A murder that may have left a presence behind. And a tape, yes, a real one. So disturbing, it was locked away for years. In Volume 3, we face not just hauntings, but the possibility that some films were warnings all along. What if the horror movies weren't exaggerations? What if they didn't go far enough? Volume 3 will make you question why you ever watched these films in the first place.